Okay, good evening and welcome to this another instalment of the Humane Philosophy Ian Ramsey Centre seminar series, which is this year run in collaboration with a grant we have received from the John Templeton Foundation, Science, Philosophy and Religion in Central and Eastern Europe and beyond. I should probably dispatch with my obligation to thank our sponsors to begin with, who are the Institute of Philosophy at the University of Warsaw, obviously Ian Ramsey Centre, and our hosts, Blackfriars Hall of the University of Oxford. And most importantly, it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor David Oderberg, who's Professor of Philosophy at Reading University and who did his DPhil here at Oxford and previously completed his education at Melbourne University in Australia. He is a self-described non-consequentialist, and in opposition to philosophers like Peter Singer, he has authored over 30 papers in philosophy. A few more than that. Over 30 includes any number over 30. And at least 4 books. Including Essentialism, Applied Ethics, Moral Theory, and the Metaphysics of Identity over Time. And today he's going to be speaking to us on a topic in metaphysics, recovering the hierarchy of being. So please join me in giving our speaker a very, very warm welcome this evening.
Thanks very much, Nikolai. So the first thing is, am I being heard okay? Yep. And how long am I instructed to speak for before I draw it to an end? 45 minutes?
40 minutes, and then with some time for questions.
Okay, that should be fine. I'm not quite sure, because this is in the form of a PowerPoint rather than my usual thing, which is to kind of present a fully written paper. I'm not quite sure whether I'm going to finish too early, too late, or what, but I'll try and make sure that I'll string it out if necessary to make sure that it finishes right on the dot, 45 minutes. So thanks very much for coming to this talk. So yeah, the topic, recovering the hierarchy of being, is something that I've been thinking a lot about recently, and kind of in the process of developing a paper, hopefully for publication in the not too distant future. It's a topic that I've been interested in for a while, but it just sort of had an opportunity presented itself to actually work something out in a more kind of rigorous way than just simply having a few intuitions. The intuition being, I think some things are better than others. Some things, and not just morally, not just normatively, but some things are metaphysically better than others, basically, is the intuition. So I'm going to try and explain what that actually means, and why I think this concept of the hierarchy of being is so important, and why it is, contrary to appearances, capable of being recovered, basically. So here's a famous quote from Alexander Pope, Essay on Man, talking about what's usually called the great chain of being. That I'm sure you'll be familiar with the term, and probably some of you will be familiar with the quote: vast chain of being which from God began, nature's ethereal, human, angel, man, beast, bird, fish, insect, what no eye can see, no glass can reach, from infinite to thee, from thee to nothing. I'm not a huge poetry expert, shall we say, not really a huge poetry reader, but I really admire poets who are able to put abstruse philosophy into quite pithy lines in the way that Pope does, because there's so much philosophy just encapsulated in a really genial way in that passage. So when we think of the great chain of being, which I will sometimes refer to the great chain of being, but I don't like the terminology. I prefer just the more neutral, bland term, the hierarchy of being. Is associated most famously with the book by Arthur Lovejoy called The Great Chain of Being, which came out in 1936. That's a monumental work in the history of ideas, and arguably it is the book which kind of created the history of ideas as a discipline. really. Many people attribute the history of ideas to Lovejoy and his famous book, The Great Chain of Being. The book is a history of the idea of the great chain of being and the kind of sub-ideas which are part of that, from Plato right through to the Enlightenment. And Lovejoy describes it as a part of the history of Western man's long effort to make the world he lives in appear to his intellect a rational one. And he quotes T.H. Green, "Why should the world as a whole be what it is?" And the great chain of being is supposed to be an answer to that perennial question. He goes on to say, if the world's being or extent or range of diversity which its components exhibit have no intelligible reason, then they might equally well have been other than they are. The constitution of the world would be but a whim or an accident. So the idea of the great chain of being, or the hierarchy of being, is probably the most, I think, one of the most significant attempts in the history of thought to answer questions like, why is the universe the way it is, and rather than some other way, and why does the world have the kind of constitution that it has? And importantly, Lovejoy is very quick to kind of dispense with any crude kind of sciencey answer to the question, which would appeal to, say, the fundamental laws of nature or something like that. He says, well, what we're interested in is also the conformity of the world to the very curious set of primary laws which empirical science discovers. These can't just be brute facts. Now, obviously, probably most people nowadays, I guess, well, no, many philosophers nowadays would say, well, no, they are brute facts and so on. So we can, that's something we can discuss. But he, and I'm with him on this, think that these can't just be brute facts. But, if there is going to be an explanation in the offing, it's got to be an explanation which encompasses both the fundamental laws and the particular constitution of the world in conformity with those laws. So historically, the great chain of being was the way in which Western man from Plato right through to the 18th century made the world intelligible. So this is hard. I mean, it's hard for me, and it's hard for, I'm sure, I would say probably everyone in this room, to understand, to appreciate the importance of that last fact, that last historical fact. So when I first came across the Lovejoy's book many years ago, I can't remember when I first saw it in some bookshop, and I immediately dismissed it as some kind of weird, pseudo-New Agey kind of thing, which it was not the sort of thing that would be on any respectable philosophy syllabus. It's not something that I ever encountered as a student. It's just not something you would have expected any philosopher to teach, other than perhaps in a specific course on the history of ideas. So it didn't seem to me it's just one of those kind of things, a bit like, so I'm going to be, I was going to say a bit like books by Mortimer Adler, but that's really unfair, because although he's not taught, there's, a lot of good stuff in Mortimer Adler, but there's kind of books which came out of America in the 30s and 40s, 50s, which are kind of somewhere on the periphery, if you like, of philosophical, mainstream Western philosophical thinking. But, once you get into it, you realize that that's such a wrong way of looking at things. And what Lovejoy is exploring here, the great chain of being, is this is a concept which from Plato, I mean, this is no exaggeration, from Plato to the 18th century. So we're talking, over 2,000 years. This was the way in which Western man made the world intelligible. Not the only way, there are other things going on, of course, but that was one of the main conceptual tools that were used, or conceptual kind of structures or frameworks which Western man used to make the world intelligible for 2,000 years. Well, where is it now? It's gone. And you really need to pause and reflect when you think about the fact that any idea that was so prevalent in philosophical thinking for 2 millennia or more is virtually absent from the intellectual landscape. You must ask yourself, why is that? Was it such a bad idea? You know, is there not anything of value there, given that for 2,000 years, Western man made the world intelligible by appeal to it? And that's kind of the starting point for me, you know, that you know, if philosophers have thought of something so fundamental to their worldview, and not just philosophers, but you know, people of all kinds and stations in life have had something like this in mind for such a long period of time, there's something to it. Well, the chain of being, as Lovejoy analyzes it, is broken up into three fundamental principles. One is the principle of plenitude. And it's hard to find, I mean, so Lovejoy's own formulation, I just realized I'm missing quotation mark there, sorry about that. Lovejoy says, the universe is a plenum formarum in which the range of conceivable diversity of kinds of living things is exhaustively exemplified. And actually, yeah, see, one of the problems with the book is that when you go hunting in the book for a rigorous statement of the principle, of the fundamental principles, they're actually quite hard to find. The principles are kind of enunciated sort of in passing, but he never stops in the way you kind of want, or at least as a kind of analytical philosopher, I kind of, you know, you want to say, right, here's the principle, give it a label, and give me that principle in a more rigorous way. So, you know, living things, actually, it's not just living things. And even Lovejoy recognized not just living things, plenum formarum, but he mentions living things. Daniel Wilson, who has written a very interesting, at least couple of commentaries on the reception, the content and reception of Lovejoy's book, frames it as all conceptual possibilities must be realized in actuality, the principle of plenitude. Again, that's not as rigorous as it could be, but it's maybe a little bit better, or at least an acceptable alternative to the slightly more restricted version given by Lovejoy. The principle of continuity, again, it's a tough one to make a bit more rigorous. He states it as if there is between two given natural species, now he's not talking about living things necessarily, now just natural species, if there is between two given natural species a theoretically possible intermediate type, that type must be realized. Because if not, then the principle of plenitude would be false. If continuity is false, then plenitude is false. Plenitude entails continuity. And then, as he puts it, really echoing the kind of the Neoplatonists, the good or the absolute would be lacking. There'd be something missing in the absolute's manifestation of itself by the diversity of forms. And then the principle of gradation, he says, all things may be arranged in a single graded scala naturae according to their degree of perfection. So the scala naturae, just a very familiar concept, the ladder of nature.
Is this Wilson?
No, the 50s, that's Lovejoy. So the picture, again, this is Lovejoy talking. The conception of the plan and structure of the world, which through the Middle Ages and down to the late 18th century, many philosophers, most men of science, and indeed most educated men were to accept without question, the conception of the universe as a great chain of being. Again, the universe composed of an immense, or by the strict but seldom rigorously applied logic of the principle of continuity, of an infinite number of links ranging in hierarchical order from the meagerest kinds of elements which barely escape non-existence through every possible grade up to the ens perfectissimum, or in a somewhat more orthodox version, to the highest possible kind of creature, between which and the absolute being the disparity was assumed to be infinite, every one of them differing from that immediately above and that immediately below it by the least possible degree of difference. There's a lot to take in there, and we can go back to that and maybe try and tease some of that out if you like. I mean, again, there's a lot of question marks over the formulation and how to understand it. Well, the great chain of being broke, and the evidence for that is that no one believes it anymore. It broke. I mean, Lovejoy does his best to kind of, trace it, and he does really an amazing job. I mean, the patience required to do the kind of conceptual kind of archaeology that he does is quite astounding. Sometime in the 19th century, over a period of time that we don't know exactly the extent of, people just stopped believing it. Why did the chain break? Well, I think there are reasons that are both moral and metaphysical, and this is a bit of Lovejoy talking and a bit of me talking here, so I'm not saying that all of this would be something that Lovejoy would agree with, but quite a bit of it. He's most interested in the fifth reason that I've listed here, evolutionism. That's by far the dominant cause for the break of the chain, according to Lovejoy. But the way I see it, you've got a number of things. One, the Protestant Reformation. These are overlapping causes too. I'm just picking sort of things, picking events and moments in history out. There are overlaps between them, but each one, has things going on in it which I think explain why it was that the chain kind of melted away, as it were. So the Protestant Reformation, which obviously has many, many facets to it, but I think the kind of leveling that you get, at least among some of the Protestant sects that broke away from the Catholic Church, the kind of leveling effect you find and the kind of democratization of religion, if you want to put it that way, tentative democratization and privatization of religion, I think contributed to a more skeptical attitude towards divinely ordained hierarchies, I guess. Now, that's very rough and ready, and again, I'm sure there'll be people in the audience who will have views about that, and we could maybe talk about that. But so that's one cause that I identify, which Lovejoy doesn't put as much emphasis on. Then you've got Galileo, Newton, and the Copernican principle, right? The idea that man was dethroned from the center of the universe through the work of first Galileo, but primarily Newton, Kepler, and the whole heliocentric theory. There was just no longer a place for man at the center of that. There was no evident way in which you could extract any kind of metaphysical hierarchy from the whole heliocentric system, and the Copernican principle, which stands to this day, that there is no kind of privileged, point of reference in the universe, and the Earth is not the center of the universe really has no center, and so on. And don't ask me more than that. I'm not a physicist. Again, we could perhaps, talk about that if people want to. But anyway, Copernican principle, no privileged center of the universe. Anti-feudalism and egalitarianism, again, the leveling that you get through various social movements and anti-hierarchical movements is going to naturally feed into a loss of belief in any kind of transcendent hierarchy that somehow ordered the universe. The Enlightenment, again, in some respects. Now, in the Enlightenment, you find the hierarchy of being still held onto very strongly in the Enlightenment by Enlightenment thinkers. Man is the crown of all creation, and the Creator is maybe kind of some sort of deistic, impersonal kind of being, but man is the crown of creation, and man is in control of nature. So all that kind of rationalism that you get from the Enlightenment is all there, and so that's not particularly inimical to the hierarchy as such. But again, within the Enlightenment, you have political movements which tend to have a more democratizing and flattening effect on the way in which the universe and mankind and living creatures and so on are structured. Evolutionism, which Lovejoy places the most emphasis on, and he thinks that you have to replace the hierarchy of being, which is static, with the dynamic metaphysics of becoming. Evolutionism as a theory, as a kind of metaphysical view of the world, feeds into, of course, evolution as a kind of biological theory, and so hierarchies get replaced with constantly changing and mutating and transforming species, and you have extinctions, and you have new species being created or coming into existence, and so on and so forth. And finally, the other thing which I should have said really, these two things are what Lovejoy is really concerned with, both evolutionism and romanticism. In fact, actually, I sort of misspoke a bit earlier because really it's romanticism which for him is the main cause of the end of the chain. Herder, Schelling, Schleiermacher, again, theologies of becoming, of, I don't know, self-development, development of something, development of the cosmos, all of these kinds of dynamical views of theology are in opposition to a more static, hierarchical view of the universe. Another, so there was that fact, and also just to kind of zoom in a little bit, the fact is that the great chain of being, the hierarchy of being, brought with it a lot of baggage that was, not to put too fine a point on it, a bit ridiculous. So Lovejoy says, since every place in the scale must be filled, since each is what it is by virtue of the special limitations which differentiate it from any other, man's duty was to keep his place and not to seek to transcend it. The good for a being of a given grade, it seemed evident, must consist in conformity to its type. No great improvement in men's political behaviour or in the organisation of society could be hoped for. The principles of plenitude and gradation could in this way, among their many uses, be made to serve the purposes of a species of pessimistic and backhanded apologetic, both for the political status quo and for the accepted religion, whatever the religion that happened to be in that particular area of Europe or whatever. And again, Pope says, order is heaven's first law, and this confess some are and must be greater than the rest, more rich, more wise. So again, so what happens here is that the metaphysical hierarchy gets transformed into a kind of social hierarchy with social stratification, often in minute degrees here. And these two things from Diego Valadez show on the one hand the kind of ecclesiastical hierarchy and then the temporal hierarchy. So within the ecclesiastical hierarchy, of course, you have the various ranks of clergy and so on. And then within the temporal hierarchy, you have, masters and servants and, workers and more intellectually endowed people and what have you, all the different kind of little social examples of social stratification. So it got all tied up with all of that, which is, I think, overall a mistaken view of the way to use or apply the hierarchy. And Richardson's novel Pamela has a very interesting statement here. So he has one of the characters saying, wise providence does various parts for various minds dispense. The meanest slaves or those who hedge and ditch are useful by their sweat to feed the rich. The rich in due return impart their store which comfortably feeds the labouring poor. Nor let the rich the lowest slave disdain, he's equally a link of nature's chain, labours to the same end, joins in one view, and both alike the will divine pursue, and at the last are level king and slave without distinction in the silent grave. So he's just really mouthing there a kind of typical kind of view of the social stratification of the hierarchy of being, which he's not necessarily endorsing or anything, he's just, this is the... People did use the hierarchy, at least implicitly, as a way of reinforcing existing social stratification and social hierarchies. You also get metaphysical and scientific excesses as well, not just social and moral ones. So this is an extract from Charles Bonnet in his Traité d'insectologie. And, you get ideas which, I suppose it's easy to laugh at these things, but, it's easy to laugh at all science done before, the modern period or something, and so I don't want to be trying to get cheap laughs out of it, but, he's got, a hierarchy with shellfish above tube worms, above, is that moths or something? Insects, gall insects. I had to look up what a gall insect, gall insects that create little kind of nests and things on trees and plants to keep their eggs and keep their young and so on. Tapeworms, polyps, right? I don't know, is a tapeworm better than a polyp or a gall insect superior to a tapeworm? I have absolutely no idea. I'm sure Bonnet had his reasons. The thing is, okay, so I'm kind of rubbishing it a bit, but I don't want to be too harsh because presumably he did have his reasons and Bonnet was no fool. But it's just that if you take the hierarchy to such minute depths, or to such minute extents, then you end up with kinds of strata which just don't look plausible. They just don't look right. I mean, you'd have to argue really hard to be able to prove that a gall insect was better than a tapeworm in some biological way or something. So, you get these metaphysical, biological, scientific, and also moral, political, and social excesses attached, sort of like, I think of them as kind of these encrustations, or, attaching to the basic hierarchy, and which cause the hierarchy in a way to collapse. And what I'm trying to recover is maybe something in the hierarchy that can be rid of at least most of these encrustations, and present something that gives food for thought. So can we do better? Well, I think we should put aside the moral and political excesses as either wrong or as not, at least not directly founded on any kind of metaphysical truth. So, the idea, well, the king is superior to his subjects, or the king is superior to the queen is superior to the prince is superior to the princess. This is what people believed, and then all the other various ranks in the kingdom, and then down to the, you got your dukes and your earls and your barons, and all the way down to the meanest serfs, right? I think we need to put those excesses, moral and political excesses, to one side. I think for metaphysical reasons, not just so we say, why would we think the king is in somehow metaphysically superior to, I don't know, anyone else in the kingdom? The king does not have a monarchical essence, right? There's no such thing as a monarchical essence for human beings. So no king is essentially a king in that sense. The king's essence is the same as the essence that we all have, which is to be a rational animal, the essence of a human. So what has the monarchical essence is the role. The monarchical role has the essence of being monarchical, obviously. The monarchical role has as its essence certain monarchical features, whatever the features are of a king. So the role does. Now, if that role attaches to a human being in such a way that we are entitled to say that a human being is superior to other human beings, then that's not going to be for metaphysical reasons. It's going to be for moral reasons or political reasons. It will be because somehow that role has a moral superiority to other roles. And I think we can all kind of be on board with that in some way. Even in our highly egalitarian society, we still believe that we should obey those who govern us, at least to some degree, right, and obey the law and obey our judges and what have you. So we can accept all of that, but it's not going to be for metaphysical reasons, or the metaphysical essence of a judge. It'll be for the essence of the roles, and the roles will attach for moral reasons and carry certain moral features with them. Also, we shouldn't treat the hierarchy of being as a corollary of the absolute, to use a term from Lovejoy. We shouldn't think, so the Neoplatonist impetus given to the hierarchy of being, I think, is very interesting, and I don't want to say bad things about the Neoplatonists. It's just that it gets difficult to fathom, I guess, when you start thinking about corollaries of the absolute, and the absolute having to somehow being obliged to manifest itself through a stratum or strata of forms which reflect the infinite diversity somehow inherent within the absolute. You have to do a lot of work to make something graspable out of that, in my view. I don't want to completely dismiss it. I just don't think we should approach the hierarchy of being through the Neoplatonist gate. That's all I want to say. I also think, and this might be a little bit more controversial, particularly in given the location and the audience, I don't think we should assume the existence of God, or for that matter, any other immaterial agents, as part of the hierarchy. So if we're going to defend the hierarchy, sure, and you will see that God is going to have a place in the hierarchy, but I don't think it's something you should just assume. If you assume the hierarchy must contain God, then a lot of people will. I think, well, why? It's likely that one might think, well, if that's the kind of assumption that you have to make, then there must be something wrong with the hierarchy in the first place, if that's what you have to assume. And I don't think we need to assume that. We can paint the picture that has God as part of the hierarchy without assuming that God has to be in the hierarchy, maybe that sounds a bit obscure, but I'll maybe try and make that a bit clearer later. I'm certainly not, I certainly don't think, as you'll see, the hierarchy can be used in any direct way as a proof of the existence of God, put it that way. I think we need to define the hierarchy in terms of essential powers, that is to say the powers that are of the essence of the beings within the hierarchy. So what we need to do, in my view, is to look towards a highly generic hierarchy compatible with specific non-hierarchical arrangements. And I think this is likely the view that Aristotle himself had in his books on the animals and elsewhere. He allows and endorses, as far as I can tell, the idea that although there are hierarchies in a very generic, there's a kind of very generic hierarchy of essential powers among beings, that within any particular local kind of region, you're not going to be able to find hierarchies between different species of biological species of animal and so on, that there's no reason why we should expect there to be. Maybe there is, but it's not obvious that there is. And he points out examples where it's not the case. So I think that's more in line with Aristotle's view. And I think what we need to do is to make the principle of gradation the centerpiece of the hierarchy, not the principle of plenitude or the principle of continuity. It's the principle of gradation, which to me, is the heart of the hierarchy. So here's one formulation of the principle of gradation from a wonderful book, a book that is like right next to my, it's on my iPad, of course, and right next to my desk, whenever I'm working. Recently reprinted by a very good friend of mine in Germany, so it's available in print, by Bernard Woolner, called The Summary of Scholastic Principles. Principle 210 says, in material and living bodies we find an ascending order of perfections in which the higher beings have their own perfections as well as those of the lower level of being, or lower levels of being. That seems to me to be a much better way of thinking of the principle of gradation. Well, that continuity and plenitude, well, Lovejoy says, if there is between two given natural species a theoretically possible intermediate type, that type must be realized. And again, why believe it? Because, well, if you didn't believe that, plenitude would be false because there'd be theoretically possible entities which didn't exist. And Wilson, all conceptual possibilities must be realized in actuality. Principle of plenitude. Why should we believe this either? I mean, it might be true that continuity is true and plenitude is false. I think plenitude implies continuity. I don't think continuity implies plenitude. I'm not denying that there might be some form of those two principles that is true. I don't think it's going to be the forms that you typically see as enunciated in Lovejoy and in some of the Neoplatonists and so on. It's going to be something a bit different from that. But as I say, I think gradation is really at the heart of the hierarchy. So principle of continuity, here's a version given by Woolner, two versions given by Woolner. Principle 212, the order of the universe displays a gradual scale of perfections from end to end through all essentially different intermediate steps. 214, every superior nature in its least perfection or operation borders on the highest perfection or operation of the nature ranking next below it in the scale of being. Again, I think those are more plausible ways of thinking of continuity, a gradual scale. Obviously, the devil will be in the detail. What do you mean by gradual, essentially different, and bordering, and so on? I think we can say things about that. And as I develop this into the paper that it hopefully will become, I will have more to say about that. And the reference to the numbers here, so it's a constant theme of much of the Neoplatonist thought on this topic, and also I include here the Renaissance Platonists, Ficino and so on, that to draw an analogy with numbers, that each number, just talk about the natural numbers, the natural integers, each integer is made up of units, right? Nothing's super sophisticated here. So in other words, each integer contains within it units lower in the scale, and that if we think of the gradation, or if we think of the scale of being that way, then we can kind of think of, at any level you have a being that kind of wraps up within it the perfections in the lower scales, but also has more, right? Wraps up those perfections and has something extra, as each number does. And this is just an analogy, right? That this is not supposed to be some sort of proof. It's just, I think it is quite a suggestive analogy. Principle of plenitude. So Woolner 216 and 217. 216, by the free choice of the creator, the universe of being contains all essential levels of perfections and of natures. And also 217, the superior one is represented by many inferior beings. Again, I think these are much more fruitful ways of thinking about plenitude rather than some extremely strong principle to the effect that every conceptual possibility, to use Wilson's term, has to be realized in reality or something like that. Just too strong. But something like these are a bit more plausible. I think one has to do a bit of finessing on what Woolner could mean by essential levels. I think essential levels is a bit, maybe not the most helpful term, but I think that can be made a bit more precise here. I'm only kind of guessing what Woolner had in mind, but I'm going to do my best to kind of come to a reasonable interpretation. And all I'm doing here is commend to you an excellent book by Colin Tudge called The Variety of Life. If you want to be convinced of the incredible diversity of life, then have a look at this book and you'll be absolutely amazed. So, how do we define superiority? It all comes down to a metaphysical definition of superiority. We need a concept of metaphysical superiority. So, informally, members of species I'll just say species, members of. Species S1 is superior to species S2, means, or is defined as S1 can do what S2 can do and more. That's the informal idea. So recall, in material and living bodies, we find an ascending order of perfections in which the higher beings have their own perfections as well as those of the lower being. They can do what the lower beings can do and more. That's the heart, that's the intuition at the heart of the idea of metaphysical superiority. And we need to explicate can do in terms of essential powers. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about species qua species. Right. So you might have two bird species that are extremely similar to each other, but one has an ability to, build nests that are stronger than the other one. We want to say that bird is superior to the other one. This could be a purely contingent matter depending on what the environment, the niches that they're in, and so on. You'd need to do a lot of work to show that one of the bird species was superior to the other just because of a certain kind of nest building capability. That's just not strong enough. So we need to talk about the essential powers of the species qua species. And the species that we need to talk about, I think, are the most generic in the hierarchy. And that sounds weird until you realize that we're talking about metaphysical species, which may or may not be biologically recognized. So, we have to get over this hurdle of thinking that when a metaphysician says species, they mean biological species. Well, maybe most of them do, but I don't. When I say species, I mean metaphysical species, unless I say specifically biological. So it's not that weird. We want the most generic species in our hierarchy to be able to explain superiority in terms of the most generic species in our hierarchy. And these species are, and there's nothing original or unfamiliar, at least to some of you here, to recapitulate, purely material bodies, plants, animals, humans, and then query, in square brackets, disembodied minds, and in brackets, divine being. Now, the divine being is not a species. God is not a species. God is not a species. God is an individual. But it's not crucial that God be a species in order to be in the hierarchy. It's not crucial that something be a member of a species, or in some way itself a species, or to be in the hierarchy. It could be done with individuals. The main factor is essence, essential powers, and God has an essence, even though God is not a genus or a species or a member of a genus, member of a species. God has an essence, and that's enough, in my view. So the powers that we're concerned with must be the most generic. So again, you might have a cryptic plant species. These are plants that, again, morphologically are almost identical, but they have an essential difference. For example, in toxicity, you can have different fungi here which produce a different kind of toxicity with respect to grapes and blueberries, but you don't want to say, well, that fungus is superior to that fungus because that one can do this kind of poisoning, but the other one can't. Well, then the other one can also do a certain kind of poisoning that the first one can't as well. That's not going to be good enough. So merely having an extra highly specific power does not make for superiority, and it won't be absolute superiority if S1 and S2 each have one such power. S2 can do something S1 can't, and S1 can do something that S2 can't, then they'll be superior to each other, and that won't work. What we want is a kind of absolute superiority, not relative superiority. So what we're after are the most generic powers of the essences of the most generic metaphysical species of things. The most generic powers of the essences of the most generic metaphysical species of things. So the hierarchy will look something like this, and again, nothing original here. I've tweaked it a little bit in the way that I like it to look and what I want it to express, but basically, I think the Aristotelian Thomistic view of this thing is pretty much it. So, it kind of speaks for itself in a way. Just I want to point out just a couple of things. So one, so with God and angels, both of which are traditionally in the hierarchy, we're talking about, I bracketed them together as mind without body, whereas in the case of God, you have kind of active intellect without reason. So God's not rational, right? God's not a rational being. God has no reason. God has just a kind of an active intellect, which just is pure act. God just uses his intellect. Angels, on the other hand, as Aquinas points out, have passive intellects. They are told things by God, right? They don't have reason either. At least on St. Thomas's view, they don't have reason. They are given what they need to know by their Creator. You have here body without life, body and life without mind, body, life and mind without reason, body, life, mind and reason. Then it starts to get a bit kind of wrinkly up the top. Then you have prime matter, matter without form, and then you have got at the top pure act, pure mind, rational sense, sentient. And the other thing I just want to point out, well, two things. One is that I class the rational, the sentient, and the vegetative as a subclass within a broader class of living things. So in that sense, angels and a divine being, a God, are living, right? They're living, they're just not organic, right? So they're living. So I take the organic to be a subclass of the living. And pure potency is a receiver of the forms that are expressed in these various kinds of thing. Except for, only up to a certain period, not in the case of God, and equivocally in the case of angels, because angels have potency, but they don't have prime matter. So, there are little things you have to add there. And then, pure act is the creator of the things below, and pure potency is the receiver of the things above, is the basic kind of picture here. So there are some facts that we do need to account for. So one, plants are superior to mere bodies. Plants are not just another kind of body, right? So basically, if you're a reductionist, this is not for you, right? I'm not going to convince any reductionist here about any of this. If you just think that plants are just more matter and that there's nothing sort of essentially special about living things, and you could all be reduced to physics and chemistry if we just knew enough, then this is going to be of very little interest to you. Angels are superior to humans because they are obviously not just another kind of human. I mean, that's just should be pretty obvious. I mean, yeah, there are religions in which people think that humans can turn into angels, or we're all angels really, or something like that. But not where I come from. Humans are angels are not another kind of human. And bats are not superior to mammals, right? So we don't want to have our definition of superiority better not yield the result that bats are superior to mammals, because bats are just another kind of mammal. To say that bats are superior to mammals borders on the incoherent. So we don't want that result. We do want the first two. We don't want to say, well, we want all of these results. We want plants to be superior to mere bodies. We want angels to be superior to humans. We don't want bats to be superior to mammals. So the definition that I've got, at least for the moment, until someone comes up with a counterexample, as usually happens when we do these things. One can only do one's best. Species S1 is superior to species S2 is defined by two clauses. One, the set of S2's generic powers, or a non-redundant proper subset of them, is a proper subset P of S1's generic powers. And two, S1's generic powers minus P are not explained by its being a species of S2. So S2's generic powers are or some non-redundant proper subset of them, which I'll explain is a proper subset of S1's generic powers, but S1's generic powers minus all those P, the ones in P, are not explained by its being a species of S2. So let me try and explain that in the time that we've got left, maybe 5 minutes or so. Hopefully we can get through this. So the set of S2's generic powers, or a non-redundant proper subset of them, is a proper subset P of S1's generic powers. So for example, the powers of a body are a proper subset of the powers of a plant, because plants are bodies. They're just not mere bodies, right? Contra the reductionists, right? They're not mere bodies, but they are bodies. So the powers of a body are a proper subset of the powers of a plant. Plants obey mechanics just like rocks do. The powers of a human are not a proper subset of the powers of an angel, for example. Humans have reason, they have bodies, so they're not a proper subset of the powers of an angel. Angels don't have reason or bodies. But there is a non-redundant proper subset of the powers of a human that is a proper subset of the powers of an angel. Namely, intellect and will. So angels have intellects and wills, and humans have intellects and wills. So you have a non-redundant proper subset of the powers of a human. That is a proper subset of the powers of an angel. But for angels, reason is, non-trivially, non-trivially redundant, and the body is trivially redundant. So reason, I think, is probably non-trivially redundant because God tells angels what they need to know. So because he does it, it's redundant for angels to have reason. Now the question is non-trivial, well, could they have reason? Could they be given? If God withholds information, are they capable of reasoning? Don't know, no idea. But as is, officially, because they're told what they need to know, their reason would be redundant for them. And body is trivially redundant because angels don't have bodies, essentially, right? So of course it's trivially redundant. They don't need bodies. And they couldn't have them. Intellect and will, however, are non-redundant because they're essential. It's essential to angels. Angels wouldn't be angels if they didn't have intellects and wills. And two, so S1's generic powers minus P are not explained by its being a species of S2. So how does that work? Well, take the powers of a bat and subtract the mammalian powers. What have you got left? Well, this is extremely biologically rough, right? This is not supposed to be some sort of, textbook precision. It would take a lot of slides to do that. But just let's keep it simple for the sake of the presentation. Bat power minus mammalian power is the power of flight, because bats are the only flying mammals. So bats are the only flying mammals. They got all the other stuff other mammals have in various shapes and sizes. Flight is unique to bats. Now, the power of flight in bats, it presupposes and is explained by bats being mammals. That's the key point. So remember, clause 2, S1's generic powers minus P are not explained by its being a species of S2 for S1 to be superior to S2. Now, bat flight is explained by the fact that bats are mammals. So that's the standard biological kind of analysis that shows the the kind of homology of the bat forelimb and, for example, the forelimb of a mouse. So that's fine. So bats do not turn out, on my formulation, bats do not turn out to be superior to mammals, and that's just the way I want it. Because they're not superior to mammals. So lucky me, they don't come out as superior to mammals. That would be a bad result. But I don't think I haven't gerrymandered it. I mean, I just think this makes sense. Right? I think the definition I've given is I think intuitively plausible. So it's not like here's the result I don't. Well, partly here's a result I don't want. I need a formula that is going to make sure I don't get that result. But also here's an intuitively plausible formulation, and let's hope it doesn't actually yield a result I don't want. And actually, it doesn't yield a result that I don't want. Not here, anyway. Vegetative powers presuppose but are not explained by bodily powers. So yeah, if you have vegetative powers, you're a plant, then you're going to have bodily powers, but these vegetative powers are not explained by bodily powers. Remember, if you're a reductionist, this is not for you. I don't believe, and I've written extensively on this, doesn't mean it's right, but I have a developed view on this, that vegetative powers are not explained by bodily powers. So on that score, plants do come out as superior to mere bodies. Now, angelic powers minus non-redundant human powers give you the angelic intellect, which is passive and non-discursive. The angelic intellect is not explained by angels being a species of humans, which by definition they're not. So angels are superior to humans by the definition of superiority that I give. They have a passive and non-discursive intellect, which is not explained by their being a species of human. Why? Because they're not species of humans. And the same argument would apply to the superiority of God over angels and humans. Just substitute divine intellect for angelic intellect. Again, the divine intellect is not explicable by God's being a kind of anything else lower in the hierarchy, because God is not a kind of anything else lower in the hierarchy. So, yeah, it gets wrinkly at the top, it gets tricky, but I think we can fit these in. Again, it's not supposed to be an argument for God or for angels or anything. I'm just saying if you want God and disembodied spirits to be in the hierarchy, as for 2,000 years people did, then I think you can do it. If you think about it carefully, you can do it. So to sum up, the basic Aristotelian Thomistic hierarchy of being, I think, can be defended, and if you put aside metaphysical prejudices, I think it is actually in accord with common sense. Now, there might be further sub-hierarchies, but I think we should rightly reject many that were held until the 19th century. So I'm not ruling out other sub-hierarchies within biological species. I don't know how it would work out. You'd have to think very carefully about it. But I don't think it's essential to the hierarchy in the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, at least. So there's nothing that I've argued here which is inconsistent with thinking of the hierarchy more loosely in terms of godlikeness, which is a very common theme in the Neoplatonists and others, or an increase in power and or nobility, and the retreat from matter, which is also extremely important in the defenders of the hierarchy. These kind of concepts that you see among people who defend the hierarchy are not excluded by anything that I've said. It's just that I'm not defending the hierarchy in those terms. The hierarchy also does not exclude local cyclicality. So, for example, the food chain, right? We end up as food for worms, and Ash Wednesday is the perfect opportunity for us to reflect on that very important point. So are worms superior to us because they end up eating us? Well, there are places where people eat worms as well. We eat them, they eat us, well, I don't know. I could make some very unpleasant, topically unpleasant jokes at the moment about eating various kinds of animal. I won't. So, are they superior to us? Are we superior to them? Well, it's the food chain is only a chain in one sense. It's a cycle in another sense. And it also doesn't include local reverse superiority. So, in other words, there are senses in which very animals that seem quite low in the hierarchy are actually superior to us. So it's the old trope, isn't it, that cockroaches are more likely than us to survive a nuclear war. Yeah, probably. They're very hardy creatures, cockroaches, and turtles live much longer than us, etc., etc., etc. Well, there might be a kind of reverse superiority in a very local sense if you're thinking just about longevity or health or flourishing or something like that. But that's all compatible, in my view, with the hierarchy of being. And finally, you won't find an argument for the existence of God here, but I think what you will find is a kind of suggestive schema. That's the strongest that I would put it. In other words, if you think of the hierarchy as a bit like a kind of a jigsaw puzzle, so I'm going from one-dimensional to two-dimensional here, so it's not brilliant, but if you think of the schema as a bit like a jigsaw puzzle, then you might think it's a bit puzzling that there are certain pieces that weren't there, and you really might want to fill them in with some extra pieces, like, well, disembodied minds. You can have minds that are embodied, or disembodied minds. You can have, matter without form, or at least, pure potency. Well, what about pure actuality, which God is identified with, etc., etc. So I think there's a suggestive thing, but I don't think that the hierarchy was ever, or maybe not consistently, offered as an argument for the existence of God. It was more an explanation of, given the existence of God, how God would fit into the hierarchy and what makes God superior to other creatures and how other creatures are superior to each other. So that's it. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much for a fascinating, very rich, thought-provoking, and more generally provoking talk. We've got roughly the full time for questions. I can see many hands already, but we'll start at the front here with Professor Trigg. And if you could just wait until the microphone gets to you. As we've mentioned, it won't make you speak louder, but it will make sure that your comments and questions are recorded, and Ralph will come round and give the microphone to you.
Right. One of the things that strikes me about the principle of plenitude, that all conceptual possibilities must be realized in actuality, is that it actually renders empirical science pointless, because we could do all of our research by just sitting in an armchair thinking what must be the case, and hey presto, it is the case. So therefore, there is no point in empirical science. So you need a gap between necessity and contingency, between possibility and actuality, unless you want to say, well, actually, empirical science isn't what we're about at all.
So if that's how you frame the principle of plenitude, and I don't want to frame it that way, so to the extent...
Well, I was quoting the dual conceptual possibilities.
Yeah. So to the extent... So all I want to say is that I think that there might be a defense of a principle of plenitude, not that one, and I think that you're right. I think you're half right. So what I would say is, yes, if the job of science is to find out what there is, kind of... empirically speaking, then yeah, you could do it from the armchair if something like that strong version of plenitude were correct. However, I think there is more to science than just simply finding out what there is empirically. There's also finding out what things are like. And it might be that although a strong principle of plenitude could tell you that there are things that have certain kinds of features sufficient to put them in the kind of the interstices between other known existence, or maybe even other possible existence, that it wouldn't follow from that you would know everything about what that thing was like. So there might still be some empirical work to find out, well, what are these things like in their minutiae. So I think it's half right what you're saying.
I just add that in physics, this principle of plenitude does seem to be alive, because when people are talking about many worlds, they say, some mathematicians and others would say, well, there are an infinite number of possibilities, and there are actual, hence there are an infinite number of universes.
Yeah, some people say that.
Well, I think they're quite wrong. But that's why I'm suspicious of plenitude.
Yeah, me and you both. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm concerned about different senses of hierarchy of being, which you're employing. It seems to me that it's the case that one can talk about the hierarchy of created being, but it is a mistake, I think, and Thomas would think it's a mistake, to put God in that hierarchy, that God is not part of the hierarchy of being. So when you talk about God's being, God is, in a sense, beyond any category of created being, and therefore there's sometimes I think there's a sort of a proper sense of a hierarchy of being which does not have God as a part, and there's a kind of metaphorical sense in which one talks about God as the highest element, the hierarchy of being. But I think it's dangerous not to make that distinction, to make sure so that we're not putting the creator, and this is simply a metaphysical argument, we're not putting the creator as part of the hierarchy of being.
Yeah, so thanks. Again, I think, sorry to repeat myself, I think that's half right. Again, I'll tell you why I think that's half right. So, there was an extensive debate throughout the entire life of the great chain of being as to whether God belonged in the hierarchy, and if so, in what sense. This was a debate, it was an endless and maybe to some extent tedious debate about whether God was in the hierarchy. Now, you had both sides. You had those sides saying kind of what you're saying, that God is kind of, to put God in the hierarchy is in a way to categorize God, to put God as part of some overall taxonomy, to think of God as just another being only superior to all the other beings, and that's all mistaken because God is infinitely distant from all the other beings, so there's no way in which something which is infinitely distant from everything else could be superior to everything else. And then you had others who said, well, yeah, but we need to think about certain things. God is creator and God is superior to the creation. If you think God is not superior to the creation, then that's looking, I would say, to say God was not superior to the creation, not just morally, but metaphysically, would be, if I could put it in this way, offensive to pious ears. It's temerarious to make a claim like that, even if you do it in good faith, you know, and you're trying to make a good point, but it just doesn't sound right. God is superior to the creation. So then, and also, you know, humans are made in the image of God, and we're made in the image of God, but we're not co-equal with God. We're in the image of God chiefly in the soul, but chiefly in the soul, as the Catechism says, not solely in the soul, chiefly in the soul. So how do we account for that if we don't want God to be in some way superior to humans, but yet capable of being in a hierarchy with humans such that superiority shows some kinds of commonality, just to put it in a very loose sense, very loose analogical sense, some kinds of commonality. And I think the answer is to say, well, yeah, to the extent that you think of God as just another being to fit in the taxonomy in the puzzle, and that's wrong. That is wrong. I agree with you. To think that there's some measurable distance, and I don't even know how you would do that, between God and creatures, is also wrong. And yet, I think we should say that God is superior to all other creatures, and that God is above them all. And the definition I give, although I didn't go into the details of that, the definition I give would achieve that for God. That God would come out, as you would hope, superior to all of the creation, without, as I actually said in passing, requiring us to think of God as being in a species, or a genus, or in a genus, or just another being. You can just say God is an individual, and God is individual, in fact. In terms of natural reason, pure natural reason, God is just a particular individual, a being, not a kind of being, just a being, and God has an essence, right? There's a divine essence. So surely, surely it's not an argument, but it seems to me intuitive that essence, the essential powers of God, and God has essential powers, is going to be the source of the explanation of why it is that this other intuition is true, namely that God is wholly dominant over and wholly distinct and superior to all of the creation. So that's how I would answer that kind of question, if you get what I mean.
We've got many more questions, and I assure you I'm not following the hierarchy of being in picking you out. Only who raised their hand first, so it will be Samuel Hughes.
Is there any possible to get some more water?
Yes, of course.
Do you mind? Thank you.
So I think it's really interesting and really very intuitively attractive and solves a lot of the normal problems that people raise with this. So I'm not sure I've quite got this right in my mind yet, but I'll go. So I'm just trying to work out what the significance of metaphysical superiority is. So I've got I think some of these kinds of chains of being in the past, I've got a kind of foggy notion that is quite normatively significant. So the old classical theory of beauty, people talk about beauty as a pursuit of perfection, or the ideals of classicism as a pursuit of perfection. And then there are ideals of human conduct, which are supposed to be about trying to approximate perfection. Right? And that makes this all extremely important. If something like that's right, then it has a great deal of significance for how we live. But I can just imagine this challenge to what you're saying, which is that you've told us that some things have powers that other things don't have. We knew that. You told us that there are some genera, species of things, which have highly generic powers that other genera don't have. We knew that as well. But so what? What does the claim of superiority add to the mere claim of some things have powers that other things don't have? And if it's like, oh well, what it adds are these normative implications about beauty or the good life, then how do those, if you, I don't know if you want to add those, but if those are what are added, how do those implications follow from the mere fact of differential powers?
So I made a real point of not going down that alley, right, as you can tell, right. I've very carefully eschewed any attempt to draw out, shall we say, I think of kind of more normative consequences of this hierarchy. I'm not even sure in my own mind whether I want to go down that path at this stage. I think it can, part of what I'm doing here is, what I had to do was to kind of tear away the hierarchy that I think is plausible from the kind of accretions, which are largely kind of normative and moral, which have built up on top of it over the centuries, which caused the whole thing to collapse, actually. So I think, in a way, and this is going to probably sound like a bit of a cop-out, but I just don't think now's the right time to talk about that sort of thing. Let's try and see if any philosopher in the world is willing to agree with some of this before we begin to think about whether there are any normative consequences. So that's kind of a cheap answer. Now, I think that, the obvious thought that comes to mind is that, well, inferior species in the hierarchy are in some sense for the beings that are above them. Now the question is, well, if that were true, what kind of forness would that be? They subserve them. What kind of, now, the term subservience, you say subservient, and then immediately you start thinking about, the master is superior to the slave and all this. That's why I just think that this gets us takes us in the wrong direction. Talk about forness. In what sense is, the other bodies, the mere bodies, for the plants and the animals and humans, and in what sense are the plants for the humans, and what sense are the animals for the humans? Well, Aquinas talks about this at length, as do others. I think there is a kind of notion of forness to be had here, again, pretty intuitive in the way in which things that are superior in the hierarchy make use of things lower in the hierarchy for their own well-being and flourishing. So there's that kind of normative aspect, which is not, by the way, in itself a moral feature. So I think it's a normative feature. So I think the next step, if you were to try and think about what are the consequences of this, if it were true, what would follow? Well, I think the fact that if it were true, that would be pretty important in itself. But what would follow from that, normatively speaking? Well, you don't immediately get into anything moral. You have to look at kind of the normativity of the setup. And the fact is, minerals feed plants, and plants feed animals, and animals feed people. But people don't feed angels, thank God. And angels don't feed God, and we don't feed God. And so, obviously it starts to break down. So I think the normative aspect of it is going to be if there is one, is going to be, it'll be multidimensional. It's going to be, and I think it will be some sort of scale, but it's going to be multidimensional, and it's going to probably have some interesting features to it. So I'm just not going to say more at this stage because I just think now's not the right time for that kind of investigation. I've got to get my head around, this first. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Fascinating presentation. I want to just register a couple of historical considerations in relationship to what Bill and Roger have said in relationship to modern science and the doctrine of God, respectively. First of all, it could be argued, and I think there's a very strong argument, that actually what got Christians persecuted was that they were seditious because they were seen as rejecting the hierarchy of being, whether understood on Neoplatonic or on Stoic lines. Second point would be that the doctrine of creation out of nothing, as it developed, was a rejection of the hierarchy of being as it had been expressed in pagan philosophy and in forms of Christianity which we now reject because we call them Gnostic. Thirdly, from the doctrine of creation out of nothing, it becomes possible to talk about Jesus Christ as having his own distinctive identity and reality, so that the Platonic demiurge, as a principle of continuity, drops out of the cosmic hierarchy, and you have a gap, as it were, between God and creation. And that enables the Christians to understand the saving work of Jesus Christ. So again, to understand the saving work of Jesus Christ, one has to drop a Platonic or Stoic hierarchy of being. And fourthly, there will be some in this room who will agree and some who will disagree that, in fact, a Thomistic understanding of analogy secures the distinction between God and creation, and the Scotist univocality doctrine of religious language actually serves to promote a hierarchy of being.
So, okay, so there are three. Oh, there's another point. Oh, sorry, do we want to?
There was sedition.
Yeah, there was persecution, there was creation out of nothing, the saving work of Christ, and then something about Scotism.
And then Thomism versus Scotism.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly look to. Yeah, unsurprisingly, I would disagree with pretty much all of that, although I think it may be that I'm just having trouble understanding. So, look, just to dispense with the fourth point, I mean, I've never once read Scotus without being completely baffled by what he's talking about. So, Scotus enters into the debate over the hierarchy primarily in terms of the tension between the kind of Neoplatonic understanding of creation as emanation and God as freely creating. So, you could probably make a case that Scotus's understanding of the totally inscrutable will of God to create is in some sense inimical to the hierarchy. I wouldn't necessarily dismiss that, but I'm no Scotist and I'm no expert on Scotus, so I'm just going to leave that there. In terms of the three previous points, I'm not quite sure I understand them. So just to pick one, I didn't get the point about when you talk about Christians being persecuted, when Christians have been persecuted ever since there have been Christians. So what point in history are we talking about?
So this is about where the hierarchy of being gets broken up.
Right.
I'm an Anglican priest.
Yeah.
I recognise the Protestant Reformation was damaging for Christendom, but I would want to say that there are other trends already in place that break up the hierarchy of being, including all those four things which I've mentioned.
So how does the persecution fit in there?
Because there is a Stoic Neoplatonic conception of the hierarchy of being, where as above, so below. So if you don't worship the emperor, your metaphysics is out of order, and both of those are unacceptable in that worldview, and Christians repudiate that worldview by refusing both the metaphysics and the earthly hierarchy in refusing to pay obaisance to the emperor.
Yeah, see,
and this is, we're talking about the first few centuries before Nicaea.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Just that, I mean, that seems to me a real stretch. I mean, I don't know, there may be something to that, but just, boy, you'd need to fill in a lot of gaps in order to make that case. You know, the Christians of the early centuries of the church were far less interested in hierarchies than they were in surviving. To say that they, you know, repudiated the emperor, I mean, even that is a highly tendentious way of putting the attitude of Christians towards their earthly masters. And even if they did, somehow implicitly, if they were seen as rejecting the pagan hierarchy, that doesn't mean that they rejected all hierarchies. They rejected the pagan hierarchy. And the deification of the emperor and you know, that sort of thing. It doesn't mean they rejected all hierarchies. So I think there'd be a lot of steps in that story that you'd need to fill in to make a plausible case. I mean, in terms of, again, I couldn't understand, and feel free to chop me off if you want. But creation ex nihilo. So how does creation ex nihilo militate against hierarchy? I missed the argument. How does creation ex nihilo? How does that militate against the hierarchy?
Because it introduces an absolute distinction between God and creation, and it's that absolute distinction which makes science possible on the views of many historians of science.
Right, so this harks back to the point that was made earlier. Well, yes, but I don't think that undermines the hierarchy. It just makes clear how you should understand the hierarchy. So, you know, it's one thing to repudiate the hierarchy, it's another thing to misinterpret the hierarchy. Creation ex nihilo means that you need to understand the hierarchy very carefully, right? That you can't just put God at, you know, the diagrams and kind of medieval kind of pictures that I showed you, just angels are sitting at the top and there's just God is above everything as though God is just another thing in the hierarchy. These are just ways of presenting these things to popular consciousness. Of course, you know, God is completely, utterly distinct from, and to the extent that one wants to use this terminology, I'm not infinitely distanced from creation. Again, I'm not quite sure how to understand infinite distance here other than metaphorically, but God is utterly distinct from and infinitely distant from creation. I don't think that of itself, at least if my definition is correct, which it may not be, but if it is plausible at least, it's not clear why God would not come out as superior to his creation, at the same time as being utterly distinct from it, and why one would expect that God wouldn't be metaphysically superior to his creation. Why would one resist that? The only reason I can see for resisting that would be to say, well, because if you do that, then you're just treating God, you're conflating the creator and the creature, and you're taxonomizing God, etc. But I'm saying, no, I don't think you need to go down that route. You don't need to do any of that in order for God to come out as superior to other creatures, and you know, one could spell that out. So I mean, okay, I'm just going to throw this out there, and I need to work on this and to make sure I'm getting it right. But just to throw it out there, if you want to say, well, okay, so I can understand how God is superior to angels because there's a non-redundant proper subset of the angels' generic powers, namely intellect and will, which are also God's powers, but God has powers which are not explained by being any kind of angel, because God obviously isn't a kind of angel. But then what about God being superior to rocks? God is superior to rock. How does that work? Well, is there a non-redundant proper subset of rock powers which also belong to God? Well, no, because that really would be conflating the creator and the creature if you started wanting to give God some kind of body or something like that, other than, you know, I'm not talking about the incarnation now, I'm just talking about God as a spirit. That wouldn't look good. So one has to say something like, well, it's the null, it's the null set. There are no P, the non-redundant proper subset of God's generic powers that are found in rocks, is just the null set. I don't see why that wouldn't be a problem. And so, of course, the null set is going to be one of the proper subsets of God's powers. And of course, God has powers that are not explained by being a kind of body, because God isn't a kind of body. So, it kind of, I think it can work out okay. But nothing that I'm saying there, I think, it commits me to conflating the creator and the creature, anything like that. So, anyway.
But we have time for one more, perhaps two if they're very short. One will go to Sebastian, and we'll see how we go from there. See how short.
Very short, Sebastian. Do you know what that means?
So, one of the things you dismissed as an excess or now an accretion is the applying this notion of the hierarchy of being to political and social questions. Yep. It strikes me Edmund Burke and Joseph de Maistre both begin their works criticising the French Revolution with an affirmation of the hierarchy of being. And I worry that your dismissal of this presupposes a too sharp distinction between, or division between, the metaphysical and the moral. Yes, I know I have to be short. Okay, so something like this. Presumably, the king at the beginning of the dynasty, or is just a conqueror and a marauder or whatever, and might not have that moral claim. But after 4 generations of the accumulation of the wisdom for regnative prudence or whatever, then now you have someone who has actuated a potency of their nature that no one else in the kingdom has, and therefore this is actually a very sound application of the hierarchy of being.
So how is that a sound application? Just to get the last bit. I missed the last bit.
That if you grade natures in the hierarchy of being, at least in part according to their capacities, both in act and in potency, then you've got one person down the dynasty who actually has actuated a potency, namely regnative prudence, that no one else in the kingdom has. If, say, Michael Oakeshott is right, that it takes 4 generations to acquire the virtues necessary to govern. Don't make him hand the microphone back to me.
Well, you're talking there about virtues, which shows that precisely then when it comes to something like the superiority of the monarch, that the superiority of the monarch is a moral superiority. If there is any superiority, it's moral, not metaphysical. You're talking about the virtues of the ruler. Then if there is a superiority there, it will be moral. It won't be. It will be, it'll be a right to a certain kind of obedience and a right to a certain kind of rule, and a right to to practice certain kinds of virtues that are proper to a monarch or proper to a ruler that the subjects are not entitled to exercise. None of that shows that there is such a thing as the monarchical essence, other than the essence that belongs to the role, not to the person. So it doesn't matter how many generations pass. It doesn't matter how many kings a king is born from. It doesn't make them any more essentially a king than if they are the first king ever to be crowned. It doesn't matter whether you're King Saul or whether you're, Jeroboam or something like that. It doesn't matter when. You no more have the monarchical essence by a fluxion of time than you do by some kind of miracle, other than a specific divine intervention, I guess, to confer authority, as in the case of Saul. But, these things happen in various ways. There are certain processes whereby one becomes a king. There's no such thing as the kingly essence that attaches to the king. It attaches to the function. And so, again, if you're going to move from a metaphysical account to a moral account, you're going to have to go through a number of steps that I don't go through, and I'm not quite sure how that would work. And in a way, again, this could be just a bit much here and a bit kind of too kind of top of the head stuff. But in a way, I wouldn't want that to work. I would be very surprised and find it a bit disconcerting if you could generate moral hierarchies just out of metaphysical hierarchies. Just like that, as though some sort of metaphysical superiority just entailed, without further argument, a kind of moral superiority. Because then what work is morality actually doing? What is morality? What is moral authority? What is moral superiority? If it just falls out of a metaphysical account of everything, that looks so... that's like the hierarchy. It could be the hierarchy in the worst possible sense, the sense that I could understand why an early romantic who was confronted with that kind of thinking would just reject it. There's got to be more give and take here. There's got to be a kind of, discursive process whereby you get from a metaphysical hierarchy of some kind or other to a moral hierarchy of some kind or other. And it was part of the fate of the hierarchy that I think those steps weren't taken, at least in the latter stages. It just became such a commonplace. You find it in poetry. When you get to the point that you're finding philosophy just kind of routinely churned out in poetry for for large numbers of people, then probably something's gone wrong. Probably, this is not being represented correctly. So I just would want to say that you'd have to go through a lot more steps to get to where you're suggesting from where I am, if that kind of makes sense.
We've got 1 minute for a final question at the front here. I know there are several hands up, but we'll have a little bit more time after the formal part of the evening is over.
I was interested in your comment that evolutionism was one of the things that came to undermine acceptance. It puzzled me because, of course, there are lots of different varieties of the chain and of evolutionism. Lamarck, for example, seems to have something like a chain of being at the center of his evolutionary account. And Darwin also talks about higher and lower sometimes. For example, in The Descent of Man, where he talks about animals having inchoate versions of powers well developed in human beings, those seem to be reconcilable with some conception of a great chain of being.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. And Lovejoy, when he discusses this, points out that it's not that evolutionist thinking, in a very broad sense, that it does away with all hierarchies. He doesn't say that, and it doesn't. What he says is that evolutionist thinking turns a static kind of self-contained hierarchy into a dynamic, gappy hierarchy where you have, for example, extinction. So one of the things that really started to upset the apple cart for believers in the hierarchy was when people discovered extinctions. It's like, well, hold on, everything is supposed to be instantiated, so what about these extinct creatures? Well, of course, you can do a temporal bit of, work on that and say, well, actually, instantiated at some time or other in the Earth's history, but, that might look like a bit of a cheat. The fact of extinctions does seem to make the hierarchy look more dynamic rather than static. So you're right that the evolutionist thinking doesn't do away with hierarchies, but these kind of hierarchies are going to look so different to the metaphysical hierarchy that I'm talking about, because the kind of superior powers are going to be very narrowly circumscribed. They're going to be very particular. They're going to be multidimensional, and as Aristotle says in his commentaries in his books on the animals, that you have cases of animals where one has one particular kind of power superior to another because it can do things the other can't, but the other one has another kind of power that bats can fly, mice can't fly. If you're a bat, in some ways you're superior because you can escape certain kinds of predators that a mouse can't escape. You can escape a cat much more easily than a mouse can escape a cat. But on the other hand, bats can't run, and if a bat happens to fall to the ground and hurt its wing, then, it's going to be in big trouble, whereas a mouse can scurry off, right? So you can have all that. So it doesn't, but those kinds of hierarchies, they are very kind of messy and, not very orderly and so on. They're going to look quite different.
Superb. As I said, many more questions, but there are still some refreshments at the back, so for those of you who want to hang around and ask our speaker a few more questions, we might have a little bit of time for that still, but before we do, please join me in thanking Professor Oderberg once again for this evening.